That's ultimately where I usually come down with Lucas when people ask about him selling Star Wars, and what Lucas did was gave us a gigantic sandbox to play in, and Favreau and Filoni are having a blast in it right now, and I think I think he likes that.
That is Brian J. Jones, author of George Lucas: A Life, who's back to talk about season 2 of The Mandalorian. Let's do this. You're listening to the Tomorrow Society Podcast. Thanks for joining me here on episode 129 of the Tomorrow Society Podcast. I am your host, Dan Heaton. I'm very excited about this week's show. It is all about The Mandalorian, which finished its second season in mid-December. I really enjoyed this show. I think they did some very interesting things with expanding the world, and just will continue to do so with all the other shows coming on Disney Plus in the next few years. My guest today is Brian J. Jones. He's the author of biographies of George Lucas, Jim Henson, Washington Irving, and Theodore Geisel. He's been on the podcast 2 other times. The first time we went through his background, talked a lot about Lucas and Henson. Last time we dug into the rise of Skywalker, so he seemed like the perfect person, given all of his Star Wars fandom and knowledge, to dig into all the episodes, plus some of the bigger issues of season 2 of The Mandalorian, which of course has a lot of connections to the original trilogy, the prequels, other Star Wars series, so much to it. So it was really fun to go through all of that with Brian. It's funny, I would have loved to have talked to him about the fact that the original Muppet Show is going to be now on Disney Plus, but that announcement came after we recorded, because that was the big Muppets news of the week, which is very exciting, and I want to dig through kind of what he expects from that, given rights issues and everything else. That would have been fun too, but we still covered so much in this look at The Mandalorian. We also talked about, like I mentioned, a lot of the new shows coming up, like Ahsoka and Ben Kenobi's show and Andor, and a lot of that and what Brian thinks there. So if you are a fan of The Mandalorian, Star Wars in general, or just curious, this is a good episode for you. Before I get to Brian, I wanted to quickly again mention that I am doing a show all about Tomorrowland at Disneyland and what we can do to make it better. It has good points. Love Space Mountain, love Star Tours, the monorail, good things, but there are ways to improve it. I'm looking for your ideas. So if you have any thoughts, small or large, about what you would do to update Tomorrowland outside the box, pretty basic, it's all cool, send them to me, dan@tomorrowsociety.com, or Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Twitter's, of course, Tomorrow SOC. Let me know what you think. If you want to record an MP3, that would be awesome. I'll play it on the show, make it about 2 minutes or less. It's going to be at the end of February. Submit your ideas by February 10th to make sure that they're in time for the show. I'm really excited about it. I did shows on Epcot last summer. That topic might have been too broad, but it was really cool to get your input. I'm going to give my ideas, but I want to include yours to make it a more... So it's not just about me. There's a lot more to it. All right, well, let's do this. Brian J. Jones is ready. This is the way. I'm excited because we have new Star Wars. There'll be a lot more new in the future, but new Star Wars now with season 2 of The Mandalorian, which I thought would be perfect to talk about, especially just given all the connections it has to the prequels, the original trilogy, a little bit with the sequel trilogy. There's so much there, so I'm really excited to talk with you about it.
Yeah, I'm psyched about this, and I spent a long time on Twitter trying to avoid any spoilers, and I managed to pull that off. So I'm glad we can finally talk about it.
Yeah, for sure. Well, before we dive into the specifics of season 2, I would love to know just in general what your thoughts are about The Mandalorian overall. So have you enjoyed this? Because it's a different take on the Star Wars universe, been highly acclaimed, but I'm just curious for you what you think about it just in general.
I have, and I have to say that I'm actually surprised how much I've enjoyed it, because when the project was announced, and they're like, okay, it's going to be about this man, this lone bounty hunter, and I was like, God, I'm not a Boba Fett fetishist. Like, I'm just not, I'm not going to be one of these guys that tattoos him on my calf, and people just are nuts, and I'm just like, I'm not crazy about Boba Fett. I'm not that interested in it. Having said that, I watched it anyway, and I have loved every minute of it. It's like, first of all, I'm shocked at how small it is. And I mean that in a good sense of the word. Like, all the episodes are really intimate. And in a way, they're kind of quiet. And they really remind me of like the Man with No Name movies that Clint Eastwood did. It's sort of the lone gunslinger coming around. And, every episode he gets a mission he's got to pull off. But they're really small and quiet, which works on TV really, really well, even as you get these gigantic, spectacular, big screen special effects. So I was pleasantly surprised about how much I enjoyed it. I did not expect to. And I absolutely love it. It's one of those shows I can't wait to watch it when it's on. And when I get behind on it, I'm always very upset because I don't want anyone to ruin anything.
Well, yeah, and especially given some of the things this season, it would have been a big deal. And you bring up a really good point because, there were some good moments in the sequel trilogy, especially even in Rise of Skywalker, which I know got a lot of flack, but especially with that movie, I felt like it was almost so big. Like, you get to a point where there's like 100 Star Destroyers, and I'm like, yeah, that's a lot. That's really crazy. But then on The Mandalorian, I look at it and I think sometimes one ship or one fight seems so much more, the stakes feel so much higher. And like you mentioned, being on TV, do you think that Star Wars in general might almost, with our modern effects and everything, work better on TV because they don't have to make it so epic and so huge?
Well, I think in a way it does, because when you're on I say smaller screen units, we have like 65-inch TVs now, but it's so cool to be watching it, and then you see like these two, like that episode where he was in the cave with all the weird spiders, and like these two sort of like lone X-wings just kind of like trolling across like cops. Like that's a moment you would never put in a movie. So I think what's great about it is like the special effects are there to advance the plot. They're actually not the plot. I think that's one of the things they do really well in this. And again, when you do have a moment like, when the Slave One's being chased and they set off the bomb behind, you get great special. It's completely seamless. It looks like a movie. It's way better than Lucas probably ever envisioned in 1977. I just think the special effects don't get in the way. Which can sometimes tend to happen, especially with Star Wars and especially with prequel Star Wars. But the special effects can get in the way, and that just doesn't ever seem to happen in these. In fact, I'm often wondering how much of it is actually built. It looks like a lot of it's actually built. I don't actually know the answer to that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. They have a behind the scenes series. They did a long series for season 1. They just did one like hour long thing for season 2. But they show it and they do build some things, but it's crazy to me. They have this curved screen, and then they have a lot of times they have special effects already up there when people are recording. But it's like, it's kind of a mix, but I'm amazed sometimes by things that aren't built, like, cause it doesn't have that prequels. And again, the technology has increased so much. If George Lucas had some of this for the prequels, I don't believe they would look that way. So it's easy to take shots, but it doesn't have it where it looks lived in a different way. And I feel like these are big budget shows, but there are moments where you mentioned even just that scene with the two X-Wing fighters where it's just like them talking, and he's like, I don't know what I'm, like it's very tense, there's a scene in episode 7 of the second season where it's a conversation. There's an Imperial officer, there's two people, they're having a conversation, and it's so tense. It's totally out of a Western where it's like, who's going to draw first? And everyone's trying to figure out what's going on. And that's such a simple scene. They're basically in this drab lunchroom, and it's like amazing scene. So it's like, it doesn't take that much.
Yeah, that's what I mean when I say they're really small in a good way. It's stuff that on screen you'd be like, that's you're killing time. You're foot dragging on this, and you would knock that kind of stuff out. On TV, you can like really savor that kind of a moment. And I mean, especially when I was shocked that the episodes were getting shorter as the season went on. But like it really lets you savor those kind of great moments like it. And that's actually a great example. I mean, that's a nail biter of a scene. It's just fantastic. I don't think that's the kind of thing you would have ever put in on the big screen.
Well, no, because you would have, I mean, it might have had it very quickly or something. You have this brand new character that shows up that you don't know, and it's all on the actors to sell it, and they do, and it's just, I mean, we'll get a little more into the specific episodes. I do want to give a warning to listeners that this has been out for a little while. Brian mentioned spoilers. We are going to spoil things, so this is not just an overview. So I hate to discourage anyone from listening, but I will give you the warning that we're going to talk about season 2 and everything that happens. So there isn't going to be anything held back, but I just want to say that up front, just because, there are some big moments. But before that, even too, season 2 to me feels like it builds on season 1. It's almost like in a little ways, like now that Disney has announced all these shows, that it's like this is the building blocks for like an expanded universe, almost like an MCU. So what do you we'll talk about some of the shows maybe near the end or what they've announced, but in general, did that distract you at all, just given that there's so many new characters that jump in every week, even more I think than season 1?
No, I don't find that much of a problem, and I'm not enough of a extended universe fan to like pick out all the recurring characters. Like I knew Ahsoka Tano, like I knew her. When Timothy Olyphant showed up, I'm like, oh, it's Timothy Olyphant. I love the guy. I didn't realize that was actually a character that was extended universe. So I guess the point I'm making is it doesn't bother me when these characters come in and out, even when some of them are fan service. I think they've done a good enough job, like bringing the characters in, establishing them just well enough that if they show up again, you're like, oh, it's that guy. That they don't get actors that look alike a lot of times. So it's when people show up, you're like, oh yeah, I can't remember his name, but yeah, I remember seeing him before. So I don't have any problem with them introducing all the characters. I think they've done it very well. And again, I think it gives that universe a very real feel. I mean, it's one of those things that we can complain about or debate with Star Wars, how like everybody's always falling over each other. Like everything ends up being connected and you run into all the same people. Every episode of this, he's out and there's new people coming in. And if he wants to meet the people we saw before, he has to go back to them. He's not just stumbling over them all the time. So I think it actually makes it feel a lot more genuine.
Yeah, totally. I agree. And they do a lot of things where someone, like you mentioned Timothy Olyphant, who I was like Justified and Deadwood. I'm like, oh my gosh, he's playing a Western character. This is perfect. But also, too, you have people show up, like fairly well-known actors show up, like Titus Welliver shows up from Bosch and from Lost and from Deadwood and all these things. And he's just like this Imperial officer. And then he just dies. And I'm like, what? It's like you have people that seem like they just want to be on the show and they're not. It's not always like, or Michael Biehn from The Terminator and from Alien shows up.
Horatio Sands. That one took me a bit to figure it out.
Horatio Sands with the makeup. Michael Biehn or Horatio Sands, they show up and you're thinking, well, that's going to be a big character. And then Michael Biehn just gets killed. And you're like, oh,
yep. Right
okay.
Away.
So, but I think too, when you have a show that's really popular and that people are really into, you can bring in these people and they have their great moments. And I think we'll probably see Cobb Vanth again, Timothy Olyphant's character, in some show, whether it's The Mandalorian or
and even wasn't even in the first season when you had Jason Sudeikis playing one of the stormtroopers who couldn't hit the outside of a barn. So, another really great moment. But so it is great. You get these little cameos because you're right. I think it's the show everybody wants to do. It's like the Muppet Show. Everybody wanted to be on the Muppet Show. They didn't care what they did.
Right. And that's the thing. It only is going to increase that way. Well, so, I want to kind of talk through the season, but I promise, we're not going to dig into every little bit of plot, but it kind of go through it in terms of what we talk about. So, the premiere episode, we mentioned Timothy Olyphant's there, and this is the longest episode of the season, interestingly enough, where they have this battle on Tatooine with this crate dragon with sand people. So, you're very familiar with Tatooine and with just having it start with even this dragon. Apparently it's the bones were in the first and A New Hope. Yeah. So I don't know. What do you think of this? Like, they go back to kind of like restart with this very familiar setting and this big action and on a very familiar place. I mean, did that episode kind of work doing all those connections like that?
It did, and what I actually loved about it is them sort of humanizing the Sand People in that. Like they had to enter this sort of uneasy, detente with the Sand People in it. I mean, like that was unexpected and really cool. And I got very upset when they were eating what they ride on. I can't pull all of a sudden. So it was it was really great to go back and revisit a familiar planet. And then also to have the same people in there and having them do something a little different. They were actually a civilization, in this episode, which you never really thought of that before with them.
Yeah, it's interesting to me, like the way that they're able with the TV show and with a bit smaller scale to kind of fill in little gaps or to take little things. And I know you could say fan service, but I don't really feel that way, because even there's a scene with Timothy Oliphant where it's like he's flashing back and he's talking about, and there's a shot of all these people on Tatooine celebrating the destruction of the second Death Star. Yeah. And I'm like, oh, this is interesting. And then immediately this other group comes in and takes over. But it's like, it's a fun way to kind of give a new spin on that moment, and also to show that maybe it wasn't, that's another thing, and maybe it wasn't so great for everyone when this happened, actually.
Right. Well, and what they're doing well in this is I hate to keep dumping on the prequels, but there's that moment in the original Star Wars when they say something about like how they're returning the power to the regional governors, and you hear that, and for a split second you're like, that would be really interesting to hear more about the politics of Star Wars and how everything's set up. And then you get to the prequels and you're like, oh, I guess that really wasn't all that interesting. But what they're doing now is actually interesting. You're getting into like, how did they set everything up? How was everything organized? How was everything overthrown? Where did they go after the Death Star was destroyed? Did everybody go underground? They're actually doing a really good job of addressing the political side of Star Wars, the structural side of Star Wars, which again, they didn't do it as well in the prequels because it's almost overload. But I like those little touches like that because, again, when you're on the outliers of the galaxy, I think it gives you the luxury of, again, taking your time to look into that, to explore that. I think that's one of the things that they're doing really well in this series.
Totally, yeah. And they don't have to tell us everything. Like, it's a TV show too, so you can give us a little bit of the New Republic kind of trying to do a good job, but being in way over their head, or just, people that what they're doing sometimes isn't great for someone even like Mando or someone like that, or just all the kind of outlaw justice, or just the difference that it really has. And it kind of re-themes it, where it's like, yes, it was good to take out the Empire. Some of these people in the Empire were very bad, but that doesn't mean that then things were great. And I know we see that in the sequel trilogy, but that's a little more like, oh, here's a new Empire, which, this does hint at. This is more like, how did this impact some smaller people?
Well, it's like the scene in Life of Brian. What do the Romans ever do for us? Well, the aqueducts. Oh, right, the aqueducts. It's like they kind of have that issue with the Empire. What did the Empire ever do? Well, they kind of kept everything organized. Okay, well, apart from that, what else did they ever do? But can we talk about the elephant in the room on this episode, though? First of all, this was one of my favorite episodes of the season. This one and what I call the pirate episode. When Oliphant shows up and he's in what you're pretty sure is Boba Fett's armor, my first thought is, how did Boba Fett survive being digested 1,000 years? What's going on here? And spoiler, I'm not sure they've ever answered that question for us yet, which is making me crazy. But that was the first thing that went into my head when I saw Boba Fett's armor was I thought he had it digested by the Sarlacc.
Yeah, they do make Boba Fett, and Boba Fett does appear in this episode at the very end, though no one comes by and says, hey, Boba, to tell us, but we all know who he is. But his face is all like weirdly scarred and everything. So I think the way that they're looking at it is somehow, I remember there was a comic book that I read as a kid that had it that the Sarlacc didn't like Boba Fett and just puked him back out. Yeah, which I'm like, that's probably not what happened, but somehow either he, Mandalorians, as we've seen, Boba Fett is like the most greatest fighter hand to hand in the history of the world, basically. So maybe somehow he pushes his way out and he's almost dead or whatever.
Yeah, I don't think Boba Fett ever envisioned himself going out that way.
It's a really weird moment. But yeah, I don't know. The whole thing with Sarlacc and everything. I think the dragon is kind of, yeah. There's some line about, I think it ate one of the Sarlacc, it ate the monster or something, but it's not clear. But it is interesting I think too, it's one of those situations where if they came up with a really complicated thing where it's like, here's what happened or flashback, it would seem kind of stupid, which the prequels, again, sometimes went too far with explaining everything. Sometimes it's better just to show a guy with a big scar on his head or his head looks crazy and be like, okay, he went through something terrible. That's all we need to know.
I would be okay with that, I guess. But that was the first thing I thought was, wait a minute.
Yeah, well, he's I don't know. It's great that they got Temuera Morrison to play Boba Fett, who played Jango Fett in the prequels. He's gotten much older, so that kind of fits because Boba Fett actually does age. He's not just like a clone. And to get him, and he's a great actor anyway, just in a lot of action movies, but he brings a lot to Boba Fett. I mean, he comes in, you don't really see him, and I know I'm jumping ahead a bit, but just in general, he really owns the screen, which is tough to do in a show like this.
Yeah, no, he's great, and he got better as the series goes on too. He was really fantastic.
Yes. All right. Well, the next episode, of course, you already referenced the next episode, The Passenger, which to me, I was like, ooh, I watched this with my daughter, and she's 11, and, nothing seems too out of whack, but I think I was a little more scared than she was. She was like, those are good effects of those spiders. And I was like, that's a lot, but it's interesting that was inspired by some art from Empire Strikes Back, which some of that stuff is like, you don't need to know that, but all those spiders just, it's a different tone. What did you think of kind of the tone? This is a different episode really than any other episode on the series.
Yeah, I'm with you. That kind of stuff, like, I mean, it was like, watching The Thing or something to me. I don't do well with spiders anyway. But yeah, it was, to me, that was a frightening episode. It was a lot of fun, but the spiders really worked for me in that regard.
Yeah, and I think that's also something the show has done is they do kind of jump genres. You had one for season 1 that was basically, I mean, they've had a few of these, but it was like a heist movie where they had to break somebody out of prison. And then you have this one that's like a horror film. And then you have Westerns, like you mentioned, the pirate one. They're really jumping genres. Yet for me, somehow it all kind of works, which is not easy to pull off, I think.
No, I absolutely agree. And, and that episode tonally, I think, was consistent. But there's actually a lot going on. You're worried when he's flying. You're like, well, how are you going to keep the ship compressed? And like they answer that question. Like they're answering all those weird little technical questions that you think about, even if you don't worry about it. But like that one, it's like, okay, we've all got to sit towards the front because we've got to seal off the back of the cabin. And so when they're trying to get back in, I'm like, well, be careful, the ship's going to fall apart as you're getting back in. I mean, you're really kind of all in on everything that's going on in that episode. And there's a ton of beats. And that episode hits. It seems like a much longer episode than it is. There's a lot going on in it.
Yeah, and you already referenced the earlier scene with the 2 X-Wings and all of that's happening there. And just, I rewatching it, I was like, I remember the spiders being like almost the whole episode, and it's only like the last 10 minutes or something.
Exactly. Yeah,
and there's all this stuff with the eggs and the comedy of Baby Yoda, Grogu eating the eggs, which some people were very upset about, but it's kind of played for laughs the whole season with eating. But you mentioned also too, just the details, even before they get on, when the ship's all destroyed, he's like, make sure you use the bathroom basically before you get flying. And I'm thinking like, is this like days long? Is that going to be enough? I mean, things like that you're thinking about.
And what's so great, like that's stuff you've never talked about in Star Wars before.
Yeah, like somebody flies around an X-Wing. You're like, how does that work? Like what do you do there, Luke? I don't understand it. But but yeah, it's an interesting episode. But really, that one to me, the first 2 I think are good and they work on their own. But I feel like the season really takes off with one of my favorites from the early episodes, if not the season, called The Heiress, where we get introduced to Bo-Katan. Speaking of characters that have appeared in Clone Wars and Rebels that I admit I didn't know anything about beforehand, played by Katie Sackhoff, who was Starbuck on Battlestar Galactica, and her whole group. And this episode really moves, and I feel like is a lot of fun. I think this is the pirate episode you were talking about, but
I think so, yeah.
So what do you think of this episode? What I
love is when, you bring him in with all these other people who are, his people, and they all have their own sets of rules. Like some of them don't have to wear the armor. And others are like, you guys don't take your helmets off. What's with you savages? I mean, again, you're getting to these really great little small political pieces of the Star Wars universe. What I love about, you're almost giving him his own gang. It's almost like the Magnificent Seven in a way in this one. So I'm with you. I didn't know this was a recurring character because my extended universe knowledge is nil. And Katie Sackhoff is great in it. That's another character that like you just want to keep seeing just because she's so great in it. I think that the women that they put in this are all fantastic. And I know people like to talk about woke Star Wars and so on. Doesn't matter. Like the characters that they have in this happen to be women, and the actresses playing them are so great in this. Katie Sackhoff devours the screen. She's so great in that role.
Oh, totally. And the fact it's great that she's able to come back later in the season, because a lot of times, like we mentioned with Timothy Olyphant, you have a situation where they come in once and that's it. But all of her group comes in now and then comes back later. But yeah, you mentioned also just the female characters. I mean, you just think of the actresses. You have Rosario Dawson, you have Ming Na, you have Katie Sackhoff, you've got, I mean, the whole group is so strong. And of course, in character of Cara Dune, who's just beating everyone up basically. And I haven't even named though, like one off, like, there's really great in the next episode, The Siege, or actually it's in the Jedi, excuse me, in the Jedi episode where the magistrate her fight with Ahsoka, I mean, she's also that character. That's like a martial artist who they brought in to play that character is also great. So there's just a lot there across the board.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And it's one of those where, I mean, the characters could be anybody. They're just fantastic characters. And I love watching every episode just to watch the way, like we were saying earlier, I think the actors are all having so much fun in it because they want so desperately to be part of Star Wars that everybody, I mean, they come to play. And I think the episodes are really great because of it.
Yeah. One more thing about the Heiress too, that has like a big battle where basically they're infiltrating this Imperial ship. And I mentioned already Titus Welliver as kind of the guy inside, but there's a really interesting thing there where they start to attack and then it switches perspective. And we end up with we're watching it from the Imperial officers. Some of it's for comedy where basically they end up ejecting all the people from the ship into space and right into the air. But another thing too, is I feel like this show we already talked about it a bit, but kind of does switch perspectives and show us, a lot of these guys are just kind of these typical employees of the former empire. And we see them like the two guys like in the ship are just kind of like, well, what do we do? And the guy and the real like believer shoots them both because he knows they're not really, they're just the grunts. But it's interesting how this show really flips it around. And a lot of times we see, everyone has their own things they need to do. And some people are more evil than others, but even Bo-Katan and their group, they kill a lot of people without thinking about it at all. It's really, there's I don't know, it's interesting to me just how the perspective, we're seeing the other side a lot more.
Yeah, it kind of made me think of that conversation they have in Clerks when they're talking about, here these rebels come in and destroy your Death Star, and what's your average stormtrooper know about replacing a toilet, and how many Union, repairmen did they kill when they blew up the Death Star?
Exactly.
And that's kind of what it made me think of. It's like you got people who are just like working in the and can we talk about stormtrooper armor not deflecting anything? I mean, I've never seen such a high stormtrooper body as
it's
we're
so
seeing
bad.
in these episodes.
They're so hapless. Like there's especially the episode with Boba Fett and the tragedy, but that episode where they just keep running out of the ship and just all getting shot like over and over and over. And I'm like, why? And there's like, they're surrounding and I know that it's a way to show that Mando and Fennec and Boba Fett are so great, but it's like the whole series, I mean, it's purposely done this way, but the stormtroopers are just the worst. I mean, they're so terrible at their jobs. It's even worse than Star Wars.
I like how they've explained to us that, like, the armor, the Mandalorians, where the metal it's made out of is like the very special, the best metal for deflecting. But I was like, so why do the stormtroopers even bother? Like, I wouldn't even bother wearing armor. It obviously doesn't do anything.
Take off the helmet, you could see better, maybe. I don't know. It's like, yeah, because they're designed to be, just these killing machines. And Mando just gets shot over and over and over in his armor. He gets hit with the dark saber, he gets shot, nothing. But the stormtroopers, I guess it's designed so then when they introduce the dark troopers, they're so much tougher because the stormtroopers, I mean, they're just basically designed almost as a diversion. It's like, let's you shoot all those people. We'll bring in our real people to take the child, basically.
Right.
Yeah. So speaking of that, the Dark Troopers are introduced in The Siege, which is the next episode. This is the one that's essentially, like Apollo Creed and Carl Weathers and Cara Dune basically go do their adventure. And it's actually directed by Carl Weathers, which is interesting. He's in it a lot. And Mando's in it, but there's one point where he just has to go back to school and make sure Grogu's okay. So it's kind of like you watch it and you almost think that it's like another like pilot for another show or something, which they haven't announced. But they mentioned Dark Troopers, which I know because I used to play this video game called Dark Forces on PlayStation, which I have not played a lot of Star Wars video games. But these are characters that are in that a lot. So is there any concern? I mean, for me, I think it's great because I knew it, but I mean, I guess it doesn't. Does it really matter if most of us don't know this?
I don't think so, because I didn't know. I wasn't familiar with them. I didn't play that video game. The only one I ever played was Battlefront, and I sucked at it.
Well, I was bad at Dark Troopers. Don't get me wrong. Or Dark Forces, excuse me.
So again, but I think that's consistent. It gets back to your question about all these characters that come into it. I think it's consistent, and this is where Favreau and Filoni are smart. It's very consistent with the way Lucas treated the original Star. Let's talk original episode. Like first, I never will say episode 4. Let's talk original Star Wars. Lucas is always content to just drop us down almost in the middle of a scene, and he doesn't worry about us. He knows we're just going to catch up, and that comes from his love of Kurosawa. He throws us into like 15th century Japan, and he's like, "Don't worry, you'll get it. You'll get it." And that's what Lucas did in Star Wars, and does very well. Like just throws you in the middle of the action. He's like, you'll figure it out. And that's what Filoni and Favreau and everybody with this show is doing. They bring these characters in, and you're going, okay, wait, who is this? But you get it. Like the more you hang out, you're like, okay, I got it. And they say, oh, there's some history between these guys. Okay, I get that. So there's enough there that those of us, again, who aren't extended universe addicts, know what's going on, and those who are get that little smile of recognition. So there's something in it for everybody on that. But I think it's very consistent with the way Lucas presented the original trilogy. With that, just we're going to drop you in. We're going to bring Lando Calrissian in, who you've never heard of before. But the moment you see him, you're like, oh, he and Han have a past here. Okay, I got that. So I think they do that pretty well with this. I never get confused by characters in this.
No, and that's the thing. It's like, even just like I mentioned watching with my daughter is, she could follow it. She'd be like, okay, like she described, like, okay, Grief Targa, the Carl Weathers, is the guy who gives out the jobs. That's what you need to know. That's all you really need to know at first. He's the guy who gives out the jobs. Or someone else, like the Dark Troopers. They're robots. They're really strong. They're really scary. That's all we really need to know. And they're using Grogu's blood to possibly make them stronger. You don't need to know everything. I mean, obviously, it is a big benefit for people that do, because it just expands it for Star Wars fans that have just been hungering for this type of thing. But I still think it's works either way. Like Ahsoka, like we talk about, I mean, the really big episode in the middle of the season is the Jedi with Rosario Dawson as Ahsoka. I mean, yes, Ahsoka is someone I knew about, but I haven't watched all of the Clone Wars and everything. I just kind of knew through the ether and through just, her being such a big character. But even if you didn't know that, she gets out there with her lightsabers and starts taking people down, and you're like, that's a cool Jedi. That's all you really have to know.
Yeah, and I was the same as you. It's like I haven't watched that many of those episodes of Clone Wars and so on, but it's like when they said the name, I was like, oh, okay, I know who that is. Like, all right, I'm in on this. And when you do see her, and I knew that she had been Anakin's, Padawan, so I knew a little bit of her backstory. But when you see her and what a badass she is, you're like, okay, this is a big shot, and that regardless. So again, it's big gestures, but that's what's needed to get us oriented with this. And then once we're oriented, you can bring us along. Again, Lucas does that very well in the original trilogy.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's in that behind the scenes film that I watched where George Lucas, they do have a moment where he comes on the set and he's kind of playing around with them and stuff. And I was like, oh, that's nice. It's not that I'm thinking he's that involved, but it's just like, I can watch this and, I'm not trying to pick on anyone, J.J. Abrams, Rian Johnson, anybody, but it's just nice to see Lucas kind of enjoying it. And I would suspect, I don't know, that he probably is enjoying at least some elements of what they're doing here with his universe.
I think the DNA of that is in his Star Wars Underworld proposal, I'm sure. Where he wanted to do a TV series focusing on sort of the Hutts and the crime lords and the crime syndicates, and make it again very small in that sense, and that you've really honed in on sort of the criminal syndicate. Like that's where Lucas wanted to go on TV, never got to do it. And I think that's what they're doing here with this. So they've taken a little corner of the universe, a little something that was hinted at even in the original trilogies, and run with it. And so I'm sure Lucas, thinks that's great. I mean, that's ultimately where I usually come down with Lucas when people ask about him selling Star Wars, and what Lucas did was gave us a gigantic sandbox to play in. And Favreau and Filoni are having a blast in it right now, and I think I think he likes that.
Oh yeah, and I was very familiar with Jon Favreau through a lot of his work, whether it's through Marvel movies or comedies or his
Swingers.
Swingers. Yeah, I was gonna get to it, but it's I mean, he does a good job. I mean, he's done some clunkers, but Dave Filoni, like, I watched a lot of the behind the scenes stuff about him, and granted, he's a huge name among like diehard Star Wars fans through what he did with Clone Wars and everything, but it's been like a revelation finding out about him, because that guy is like an encyclopedia of Star Wars, and even he like explains the Duel of the Fates, the big fight at the end of Phantom Menace, like on one of them, and I was like, it all makes sense finally. Why could no one explain this to me until now? He's incredible, and I think that fandom, like, you really feel the fandom, and I think it's not just him, but a lot of it's coming from him.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and he's got Lucas's blessing, which makes it even cooler.
Yeah, definitely, and that, I mean, it makes a difference because whatever they do, you've got someone like that people know is such a fan, but also cares so much about the franchise and isn't going to steer it into something really unfortunate. Which
that's exactly the phrase I was going to use. I was going to say it's careful fan service, because Filoni genuinely loves that stuff. But the reason it's careful is because Filoni is one of those guys who, if you sit down, he's not just going to say, "Oh, wouldn't it be cool if this happened?" He can give you the backstory for like every single character that's going to be involved in it, and also the histories of any mechanics or any ship or any device that's been used in it. So that's what I'm saying. It's very careful because Filoni's really thoughtful, because he's got such the affectionate term, the nerdiest background in Star Wars, which is again exactly what makes it work so well.
Yeah, and then you pair him with somebody who, I mean, Favreau's a big Star Wars fan, but also is very good at making, like Iron Man is a really good example, making a blockbuster movie and also kind of starting a franchise, which is kind of what Iron Man did and what he's doing a little bit here with The Mandalorian, and steering the ship really well. And you put those two guys together and wow, it's gold. And many good directors and many good actors and the whole deal. Well, the big episode after, I say every single one, I think I tell you, this is the big episode of the season, and it's like all of them essentially. But the next one is the tragedy, which this is the one we referenced where Boba Fett and others just kill all the stormtroopers basically. But then Mando's ship gets destroyed. And this is directed by Robert Rodriguez, who of course did the Machete movies, the El Mariachi, and all those movies, so many action movies. And I feel like this is basically a Robert Rodriguez movie put into 40 minutes. It's basically what it is.
Yeah, right. Which again is why it's so horrifying all the time too. Yeah.
Yeah. So we talked a little bit about Boba Fett, and you were a little hesitant, and I know we talked about him just in general, but this is really the episode where he appears and introduces himself, and you have him getting his armor and fighting and everything. I mean, did you think, as someone who knows Boba Fett from the trilogy and everything else, what do you think of kind of how this played out, where really he becomes just such a big character?
I think I'm stammering around because I'm trying to figure out how I feel about this. I was glad to see Boba Fett fleshed out as a character, because again, that was always my biggest complaint about him. I was like, why does everybody think he's so cool? He's not in the movies that long, and he gets beat every time he's on screen. So it was cool to see him kind of come in, like, save the day, find out that he had a plan. You could see why he was the most feared bounty hunter in the galaxy finally. Before they were telling us, not showing us that, and now they actually were showing us that. So I think it was great to see Boba Fett finally being a real character and not just somebody who stands and looks cool in the corner and kind of nods at you and, has the reputation. Now we can see why he's the most feared bounty hunter in the galaxy. It was great.
So this is probably a good time, I know I'm jumping ahead, to talk about the show that's going to come out, which they introduced in the final scene of the season. They have Boba Fett and Ming-Na as Fennec go into Jabba's palace and kill a very fat Bib Fortuna. I don't know what happened there.
I was trying to say, so how long has it been since Jabba? Has it been 2-3 years maybe? It took it to get fat? I don't know.
I guess he became like the leader, so it's like Jabba the Hutt. You just sit there and tell people what to do. Yeah.
Exactly.
So he takes him out, and then they announce the Book of Boba Fett. It's going to be, I think, a limited series coming out in December. So I know you mentioned kind of a little reservations with it, and you wanted to learn more, but a full series. And this to me really connects to what you talked about with Lucas's Underworld. I mean, he's going to be a Hutt basically, and I don't know if he's going to deal with other ones, but what do you think about this idea for a series?
Okay, see, so again, this is my own personal bias. When I saw that they were like, and now the Book of Boba Fett, I'm like, well, forget that one. Because again, it gets back to me not being the Boba Fett fetishist. But having said that, I'll give it a shot because that's where I'm like you. I'm thinking, okay, this is going to be the real opportunity for the Star Wars Underworld. We're going to focus on the crime syndicates here. And this is going to be, is it going to be a procedural? I don't know. I'll give it a shot on that. But again, when they said, when they showed it like coming next December, the Book of Boba Fett, there was a part of me that went, God.
Yeah, well, the thing is, I'm okay with that because I feel like, one, we're both very positive on this. So it's good that there are things that don't seem as exciting because it's really easy to be like, wow, everything they're doing is going to hit. And it might hit. Robert Rodriguez is involved again, which makes sense. They had him direct the episode, which could be good. But I'm curious about it just because I like both the lead actors in it. But I understand, too, because there is a point where if you really lean into, you got Jabba's palace, you've got Boba Fett, you got everything. You could do fan service overload. I hope not. I have faith in the people involved because it's also Filoni, I think, is involved, that it's going to be great. But I'll be interested to see because I suspect the tone will be slightly different.
Yeah, and that's kind of the way I was too. As I said, there, even as part of me was like, oh, God, I'm also like, well, they haven't ruined it yet. So, it's in the right hands for me. So like I said, I will be there for it.
Yeah, totally. All right. Well, circling back a bit, there's one episode before the finale, which is, I believe, called The Believer, which this is the one we already talked about, the scene in the mess hall, which I think is the best scene in the episode, one of the better scenes of the season. But there's also this long sequence where Mando is on the top of an Imperial vehicle, and then there's all these pirates that are chasing him, and it's just like it's out of a different movie. It's like this chase scene, and he's wearing his Imperial garb and the whole thing. And to me, I'm like, one, it's like, again,
it was Indiana Jones. That's
yes,
what I thought. It was Indiana Jones.
Raiders of the Lost Ark scene, basically, right there. But it's like a different genre. But also, too, stunts are amazing. I love that there's so much physical stunts to the whole thing. It's a fun moment, at least for me.
Yeah, and it's also nice to let Pedro take his helmet off every once in a while too. Nice to see him like being able to act with his face. I mean, because he is so great in that you forget most of the time you've never seen his face. He does manage to convey a lot with the tilt of the head and his arm, but it is cool seeing him with the helmet off, and he always looks like he's going to burst into tears.
He was that way. I just watched Wonder Woman 1984, which, I don't need to go into whether it was good or not, but he's in that. And it is really weird to see him the whole movie without a helmet on or anything, but also
chewing the scenery, man.
Oh my gosh. Oh, he's like taking a movie that's like a silly movie and taking it to some other extreme world of level. But seeing that, and then you see him here, and even after he takes off his helmet in this episode, in order to basically to show how much he cares for the child, for Grogu. I don't know. This is another episode to me almost as its own thing. It's they have an objective. They need to get there. And also they get saved by the Empire TIE fighters, and the Empire all cheers for them, which to me is just like classic turnaround there. Great moment.
Yeah, I really liked it. I liked this episode, even as there were parts of me going like, if this was a video game, I would have blown my ship up 100 times.
You drove too fast.
Yeah, watching him maneuver through the canyons and stuff, I'm like, I'm dead. I would have never been able to do that. But yeah, and that's what I love about all these episodes. And again, it gets back to what I keep calling them small, but it's like every episode's got like deed of the day in it. It's like every episode of, the old Incredible Hulk. You had to like wander into town and like fix a problem. And that's kind of what every episode of this, he's got a problem to solve. And that's what I really like about this. Again, it's very small. It takes place in kind of one location for the most part, even though the world kind of opens up in this one, and you've got a couple of different acts, so to speak, in this one. It's just, it's a very intimate piece. You're edge of the seat on these the whole time.
Yeah, that's funny because part of me looks at, especially the first season, but where it was a little more episodic, but it reminds me a bit of like syndicated TV that I watched in like the 1990s, like your even not even great shows like your Hercules or Xena or like Stargate, or because a lot of it is just like, it's very simple. I mean, there is an overall story and the acting is better and everything, but it's very simple. It's like, okay, we're going to go break this guy out of prison so that this can happen, or, oh, we're going to go to this planet and, oh, these villagers need our help, so we're going to help them. It's very like those types of shows where it was very shows that could play over and over. There's a lot of that here, more than like your typical kind of like your Game of Thrones or some type of show that's really like a long story. This does kind of work on its own a bit differently.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, it's episodic in that sense. It's like every episode almost can stand on its own, because at the beginning you're given the assignment. Here's what your objective is. And then the episode is them fulfilling that objective, even as we're still advancing the larger story arc. I think, again, that's what makes these so great. You have people who are like, well, I don't know that much about Star Wars. I'm like, you know what, just sit down and watch one of these because they're really fun just on their own. So I think that episodic nature of it is part of the strength of these as well. Because it's not like Game of Thrones where you sit there and it's like every single one of them is like, it's a long conversation every episode. This one is like a sentence. It's like you get it very quickly, and then it's all part of the longer story.
It's very rewatchable too. So let's get to the finale of the season with, I'm not even going to skip. I'm not even going to talk. We'll talk about the rest in a minute, but we have the reveal of one Luke Skywalker at the end, CGI Luke Skywalker. What did you think about seeing Luke and then about how he looked?
Okay. First of all, it's easy to be cynical. It totally worked for me. Because Luke's at the stage in his Jedi career now. First of all, it's great to see him. Like they put him in the uniform, in the outfit and the look on his face. So it's like, all right, I'm like, okay, I know the time period I'm in now. It's like, I mean, I always, we know when the Mandalorian's taking place. We know it's after the events of Jedi. But, when you see Luke like that, you're like, okay, this is still fairly close to where we left off at the end of Return of the Jedi. So when you see Luke like that, and I have to tell you, the moment that actually made me well up was when R2 peeks out from behind him. That got me even almost more than seeing Luke. But again, the CGI Luke worked for me. I mean, because of the way you're doing it, he can't move around a lot, which I thought completely made that character even more. You're like, this is the Luke that's got the gravitas. This is the Jedi Master. This is the guy who can get stuff done without having to exert a lot of energy. So it totally worked for me to see the way they presented Luke. Completely, I was all in on it. I saw people on Twitter saying the CGI sucked. I didn't feel that way at all. I thought it was great. When you first see that little glimpse of X-Wing come in, there's a part, when I first saw that, I was like, oh my God, are they really going to do this? I actually managed to not have it spoiled for me, even though I was 2 weeks late on it. But when you first see that X-Wing fighter, I was like, oh my God, are they actually going to do this? Is that what they're going to do? Because when I was watching the previously on The Mandalorian, and they were showing Grogu in the mountain circle, and they're like, oh, he's calling out to the Force. I'm like, well, no one's answered that yet. We haven't got that part down. It's like they're so stupid, they're not going to figure out that plot. But I was like, well, we don't have that. We don't have the answer to that yet. I played right into their hands. But when that lone X-Wing comes flying in, I mean, there's like, I'm 13 years old again. I am so great. I was so hoping they were going to do that, but I was like, how are they going to do this? And then they're very clever putting him on the, the overhead view screens, and you see him from the back, and, you see the color of the lightsaber, you're pretty sure it's him, but you're constantly wondering, how are they going to do this? Are they going to pull it off? And in my book, again, it's easy to be cynical. I think they pulled it off.
I do too. And it's interesting because, I had not read any spoilers. I think it was just a few days after, but I didn't watch it like at midnight on Thursday night, Friday morning or anything. But I was really happy I hadn't been spoiled because, like, things are looking bleak. You've got, Giancarlo Esposito just being like, you're about to die, and all the dark troopers are coming. And I was like, oh, Boba Fett's probably going to come back and blow away everybody. Yeah. Great. That's cool. I totally didn't even think about, the Jedi and all these other things. So that shows the episode was working because I'm totally into the episode. I'm not trying, like when I'm bored by a show, I start to be like, oh, it's like picking apart what's going to happen. When I'm not, I don't even think about it. And here it's like, but you're right. When we show the X-Wing and then they show the green lightsaber and then you see the black cloak, and I'm just thinking like, No, they wouldn't do that. Because like I don't read rumors or whatever they think in advance really for this, because I enjoy just kind of knowing. And then he's just like mowing down people, and I'm just thinking like, yeah, I think they probably are. But I wondered too, are we just not going to see his face? Or are they going to, what's it going to be? And I will say too, this to me did not, I mean, it was pretty quick too, but Grand Moff Tarkin in Rogue One and Leia to a lesser extent, Grand Moff Tarkin especially, I was like, that does not, it looks terrible.
It was the video game version.
Yeah, it was like in Dark Forces from 1990s or something. But basically, this to me, they have improved the technology, and I'm not one who wants to see the de-aging all over the place. But I felt like for the purpose of the scene, I was already on board before he showed up. And then, the scene wasn't really about him that much. It was really about Mando and Grogu and what that was going to happen. He was just kind of there. It does raise a lot of interesting questions. That's kind of what I wanted to ask you too. Like looking ahead to season 3, I don't know where they're going to go with this. I mean, I'm excited about it. Are you excited to kind of find out what they're going to do now that, Luke can't be a permanent part of the show? How are they going to kind of take this now?
Well, yeah, I mean, I thought the same thing too, especially you're thinking of it even from a fiscal standpoint of Disney. I'm like, well, they're taking away a huge element if Grogu goes away. And in season 3, it's like, okay, well, we resolved that plot line. Like he rescued Grogu, didn't kill him on the bounty, saved him, turned him over to the Jedi, did his job, and now he's off to go do more new things in the season. I don't know. Will they do that? If they do that, they've shut off the cash flow. Because I was out in California a couple of weeks ago to take part in a documentary, and I just dropped by downtown Disney, and you should see the Baby Yoda merch.
Oh yeah, I
mean it is its own thing. So I don't know how they can not bring him back in season 3. But like you, I don't know how they're going to do it. So it should be. So I'm excited about just seeing how they're going to do this, because like they turned it into like Lone Wolf and Cub in a way for the first season and a half, with the two of them sort of kind of kicking around the galaxy and like solving problems together. If you take that component out, it changes sort of the rhythm of the series. But on the other hand, is their intention to like always have Mando with Grogu as the sidekick? I don't know. So if they don't do that, how are we going to manage to see what's going on with him? And because they can't take him out of altogether. Again, I don't think Disney would do that now. But second of all, I think it makes Mando more interesting to have that as his sidekick. Again, it's Lone Wolf and Cub.
I think they will reunite just because, like you've said, even just from business. I mean, my daughter has a big Baby Yoda. We've also got a Lego Baby Yoda. I mean, sorry, Grogu. But, it's still hard to remember that. But really, and I don't think we're that abnormal. I think that it's really common. Disney actually was a little behind last year, but this year they've totally made up for it with the merge. Yeah. I know, to catch up. But I think there'll be some way where I don't know if something happens with the training or basically like, somehow Grogu's not interested. I mean, we could go 100 different ways, but I don't know if it'll be the premiere, but I think it'll be early in the season they'll end up back together, because really the heart of the show, like you mentioned, is the two of them going on adventures and then him taking care. Now, granted, if Grogu gets more powerful, it's a little different than him just like protecting the child. It's more about them both having, and we've seen it a little bit, but they're both having skills. But yeah, it's interesting. They painted themselves in the corner a little bit, but I'm sure when they did it, they likely had a very good idea of what to do next.
Yeah. I mean, is this where you flesh out Ahsoka now? You does Luke put Grogu in her hands maybe at this point? And so we bring Rosario Dawson back, and she's sort of the, she's the surrogate for Luke, because Luke's, too busy building up the Jedi Academy at that point. So I don't know, that would let them bring her back so you can have her as the regular. I don't know. I don't know how they're going to do this.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, because, Disney had a big announcement where they went through and announced like a lot of Star Wars projects. It was after the end of the season, or it was right before the end, but then they added the Book of Boba Fett to it. But essentially, I'm not going to go through all of them because I know most people who listen probably are aware. All Star Wars, Marvel, and a lot of Disney animated series and stuff. But basically, they've got Rogue Squadron, which is going to be a new movie by Patty Jenkins, who we just mentioned.
So psyched for that one. That was a video game I was good at.
Yeah, that seems really fun. I think too, it's going to, I feel like Rogue One I mentioned earlier, I think is a really good movie, partially because it's kind of its own story. And again, it has some of the elements that made Mando work well, even though, characters, smaller scale. It's funny to say smaller scale when it's like the Death Star and the plans and everything. And then, of course, this is something I want to mention to you. We're not going to go through all of them, but Obi-Wan Kenobi, that series, with Ewan McGregor, and they're going to have Hayden Christensen come in and play Darth Vader in the show.
Yeah.
That's crazy to me. What do you think about that?
People have been asking for a Kenobi series for years, and I've never been that psyched about that. I don't know. And having Hayden Christensen playing Vader in the full costume, that does seem a little funny.
I think he's going to be like, they're going to, I saw, I don't know if it was like an official, I think it was a quick shot where he's just like, all like his body's just like destroyed and stuff. So maybe they'll have him like still taking off the suit more and stuff, but I'm intrigued, but I'm also a little like, what is this going to be?
Yeah. And I mean, and what can you do? It's the Kenobi era between, episode 3 and episode 4, I guess. But
yeah, it is.
So, what is it? Ben Kenobi in Ben Kenobi in Exile in Tatooine, fighting crime on the side, and then returning home every night. I don't know. I don't know what you do with this one.
Yeah, but I mentioned Ahsoka has her own show. There's also going to be a Lando show that's being some of these. I mean, these are all being developed. I assume they will happen. A character, Cass Andor from Rogue One, is going to have his own show. That one's going to be sooner. And then other animated series and beyond. But just in general, I'm not going to ask you about each one. That would, go on for a while. But in general, what do you think about just how much this is expanding? Because we kind of talked about this, how well it works with Mandalorian. It creates new stories and everything. But Disney, I mean, really, especially, I think, given just the pandemic and just the rise of Disney Plus, has just gone all in on streaming, not just with Disney, but with Marvel too, and are building this up and probably will connect movies to shows and everything, like really a full MCU. I mean, what do you think about them announcing so much to do in the next, 5 years?
I think you have to be really careful with this, because I think you run into a problem when you start making every series about a established character, and that already has its own preconceived, well-defined set of rules and expectations on this. Because first of all, you're destined for disappointment probably from a lot of people. But I also think that I think you run the problem too with again, I said destined for disappointment. You run the risk of disappointing fans who are like, I don't want that to have been, what happened to Ben Kenobi. I don't want to find out that, that R2 ended up getting, blown up or destroyed or so, whatever. I think they're on much better ground with something like Rogue One, with something like The Mandalorian, where they're like, what takes place in the Star Wars universe. We know the established rules of the universe at that point, but you've got a little more leeway with what you're doing when it's a little less familiar. You can set your own boundaries and your ground rules. When it comes to doing something like about Lando, and so it's like, okay, so we're bound to have the crossover with X, and we're the Lobot episode or whatever. So I think you've got to be very careful. You run into the problem of fan service when you have the very well established characters. Because Kenobi, I think, was born of fan service. Everybody was clamoring for that. But I just think you've got to be very, very careful when you start doing it, because then it becomes like in the prequel trilogy, where it's like all of a sudden we had to have everybody running into everybody so we could explain everybody's relationship. And, and then I'm like, Anakin Skywalker did not build C-3PO. I was very upset by that, so you run that risk when you do that, when you start piling all these pre-established characters up against not necessarily each other, but there's the urge to, do all these crossovers and tighten up, I guess is the right word for it, tighten up the Star Wars universe and their relationships to each other, where I think it works better when it's a little bit more wider open and you're hearing about characters on the periphery. I mean, I don't need to see Luke anymore in The Mandalorian because I got my glimpse of him and it was awesome. And I think if you keep trying to bring that back in, you ruin it. So I think that's the way I feel about it. You got to be very careful with those pre-established characters. I'm much higher on the book of Boba Fett, where, you're sort of going into new territory with characters we don't know all that well, and you can bring in a lot of new characters, and something like Rogue One, and even Cass Andor, because we don't know the rules of Cass Andor, we don't know the rules of his existence and his universe and his backstory. Whereas these other established characters, I think it's just I think you run the danger of ruining it for someone that way. Probably for me. I don't know. I think you've just got to be very, very careful about saturating the Star Wars universe that way.
Yeah, they're going to really have to, a lot of them are like 2024, 2025, whatever. So it's going to be a little while, but Andor, zoning in on that, it comes out in 2022, but it's described, and again, this is like a press description, as a nail-biting spy thriller created by Tony Gilroy, who's a very established director, and has like an all-star cast with a bunch of Stellan Skarsgård and a bunch of British actors. Not that automatically means they're good, but the point of it is that to me seems like a show that's really carving out its own zone.
Exactly. That's exactly it.
Yeah, so I think that's exactly what we're talking about. And one other point, too, it's almost like Solo, a Star Wars story, is like the perfect both. I feel like within that movie are both the great things and the bad things about what we've been talking about. Because you have in that movie, you have a really cool heist scene. You've got cool train moments. You got an interesting crime stuff with people we've never met. And then you have an explanation for the name Han Solo. You have finding out about the Kessel Run. You have some weird stuff that doesn't work at all. It's like within a simple movie, you can see here's the good lessons and here's the bad lessons for the future.
Yeah, there, you've summed it up perfectly, because I think there's going to be the urge to take these iconic characters, again, Kenobi, Lando, so on, and be like, you know what, we're going to answer all the questions on these characters. I think that's a bad idea.
Yeah, totally. It's one of those things where it's like, if you can use, Ewan McGregor's a great actor. If you can use his character to create a story that works on its own, if someone doesn't know everything else and isn't just referring back to moments, and you can refer back to things like casually, like little things, but it's interesting how tricky that can be. Well, Brian, just to sum up, we've talked a lot about The Mandalorian season 2, and obviously we both really like it, are excited about season 3, but what do you want to see in a future season of The Mandalorian, just in general, beyond Luke and what happens there? Like, what is something you like that you want to even see expanded more, maybe?
See, I keep using the word small, but I loved the episode with Cobb Vanth. It was funny. It was a more intimate episode. There wasn't a lot going on. You had sort of the big storyline with the big, the big dragon, the Earth dragon, but it's an episode where it's mostly character driven, and that's when I think that this series is really at its best, and they do that a lot. So I think my hopes for the next season and onward is to not lose sight of that. I don't need gigantic. I don't need a gigantic arc that's going to go on for like 4 seasons now. Where we're trying to we've got some ultimate goal or something. I don't mind the one-offs. So I'm fine with them keeping it small. I want them to resist the urge to go too big with this, because I think they're doing it just right now. So again, I like those little single, almost like one-offs, the Western episode with Cobb, the pirate episode, as I keep calling it. I think they're doing a lot of things right, and I think they need to resist the urge to go too big with it.
It kind of circles back to what I said at the beginning about like Rise of Skywalker and everything, where you think this is the last movie of a big trilogy. This has to be the biggest thing we've ever seen. I understand that. In this situation, though, it's really easy to try and build every season. And I think with season 2, they did a good job of not building too much. They built a bit, which you have to progress the story, but they kind of kept it all in check. So It's great. I think they did a great job.
Yeah, I like the idea of him, going out to find his own people, because that gives us a chance to get all these interesting takes on Mandalorian and Mandalorian lore and Mandalorian religion, and why are you guys not taking your helmet off, and why do you not care about the helmets or the armor? I think they're doing a lot of those, again, those little touches like that, where it's not a huge part driving the plot, but you watch and you're like, that's really interesting. I really like that they're doing that. I keep using the word small. They're keeping it small, and they've got enough really interesting beats as it goes on.
Yeah. You mentioned that earlier too. Like there's a quick moment where Bo-Katan says, oh, you're from that other sect that pulled away from the main Mandalorians. And he's kind of like, what? And they don't really talk about that again. They probably will, but it's kind of like my brain just like zones in on that. And I'm like, wait, is everything he thinks wrong? Is it different?
Yeah. Well, and then they've given us that really interesting, just glimpse of like he's a foundling. And that makes him different somehow. So there's a lot of cool things they can do with him and his background as they go on. They should not get carried away with it and make that like the source of the story or anything like that. Just keep doing it the way they're doing it. Play it slow, play it small. It works really well.
Yeah, and I think that's a perfect place to end. Well, Brian, maybe like after season 3 or after we've seen some other shows, we'll have to circle back and see if they've listened to our advice with their show. Come on, Dave Filoni. I know they're way involved in this already, so they've probably made decisions for years in the future. But Brian, your books about George Lucas, Jim Henson, all of them are great. So if listeners are interested and they want to follow you or anything, like, is there a good place for them to check out your work?
You can find me at Brian J. Jones, spell out my middle name because otherwise you're going to get the dead Rolling Stone. BrianJJones.com, and I'm always running my mouth on Twitter, also at Brian J. Jones there as well.
Well, excellent. Brian, thanks for coming back again. This was really fun, and it's just exciting for me to talk about good Star Wars. That's what I will say.
It's great. And again, I was so pleasantly surprised by Mandalorian. It quickly rose to the top of my must-watch list, even as it still took me 2 weeks to catch up.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Dan.
If you like this show, you should listen to Brian's 2 other appearances on episodes 66 and 92 of the Temuera Society podcast. Go to temuerasociety.com/podcasts with an S at the end to find those shows. If you'd like to help out this listener-supported podcast, there's a really great way to do so through Patreon. You can leave a small monthly contribution, get access to some really cool perks, including the monthly Temuera Society Bulletin podcast. This month, I'm going to be talking about Disney's Magical Express, which will be ending at the start of 2022. I have a lot of thoughts about that, and you can get access to that and so much more by becoming a member. You can learn more at temuerasociety.com/member. Also, don't forget, leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. I'm just going to keep doing new shows this year, and doing that really helps more people to find the podcast. Temuera Society Podcast is hosted, produced, and edited by Dan Heaton. The music was written by Adam Hookey and performed by the Sophisticated Babies. Next time, I have a real treat of a show. I'm doing another Imagineering Roundtable with Don Carson is back once again, and Chris Merritt, former Disney Imagineer and co-author of Mark Davis in His Own Words. They're going to talk about a bunch of different topics having to do with theme park design and what makes them do what they do. Thanks so much for listening. Hang in there. Things are starting to look up. Let's keep heading in that direction. Wear your masks. I'll talk to you again next time.